Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a very exciting time to be in Pulses, and as Michelle was saying, for the last few years I did work for a major industry partner in Canada at Kellogg's, and I did my doctorate in Pulses, and I never thought I'd be back in the realm of Pulses. So when I was moving a year and a half ago, I was clearing out my basement, and I had all my Pulse literature in big bins, plastic bins, beautifully organized in binders, and thinking that I'd never work in Pulses again, I had a bonfire in my backyard. Needless to say, 8 months later, I started working for Pulse Canada. So regret is a wonderful thing. So today I'm going to talk about the recommended consumption levels for Pulses, coming out with some sort of a recommendation. And really the impetus for this work was the development of a Pulse brand and a Pulse pledge in celebrating the International Year of Pulses. So it's obviously a very exciting time for the world of Pulses. A lot is going on around the world. And like I mentioned, two main projects that are being spearheaded by Canada that will have international scope is the development of the Pulse Pledge and development of the Pulse brand. And to really talk about what those two items are, the Pulse Pledge is really a consumer-facing initiative where consumers are engaged. They would go to a website, they sign up to take the Pulse Pledge, and therefore they're committing themselves to consume a certain amount of pulses per week. And in exchange for that commitment, Pulse Canada would send them recipes every week to sort of ease the incorporation of pulses into their diet. So it really is consumer-facing. It's really to garner that excitement around pulse consumption. But the real work that I'm going to focus on today has to do with the Pulse brand. And even though Pulse Canada is spearheading this does have international scope. And what we're looking at with the Confederation of Pulses, the Global Confederation of Pulses, is a harmonized utilization of the Pulse brand around the world. And you can see here, it is a nice logo. There was a lot of consumer research that went into this, and consumers seem to respond well to this logo. And you can see at the bottom here, it can be adopted depending on the region where it is going to be used. So the Pulse logo is really going to be used in two respects. One is for promotional activity, and that is with respect to associations, ingredient companies, pet food manufacturers, growers, exporters, all of the above. Essentially, when you're talking about pulses, not even necessarily in a project, it could be at a conference like this where you'd have the logo on the labeling outside the door on the banners. But the second part, the use in food products with pulses, is really the part that's really garnering a lot of excitement, because this would be a logo that would be used on food products to identify the presence of pulses within the food. In North America, I don't know if you have something similar here, we have the whole grain stamp, which is from Old Ways in the US, and it's basically showing consumers that there are whole grains in food. So this logo could be used on food products that contain pulses that contain 100% pulse ingredients, like a can of beans, or products that contain pulses as a component of the other ingredients. So it could be a flour, or maybe it only contains 5% beans, and so on and so forth. And also within the respect to food service. The only catch here is that, and it's similar in Australia, whenever you have something that's consumer-facing, you're linking a logo or something to a food, and you're talking about the food, there is the risk of an implied health claim. And that can bring in a whole host of can of worms. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But that being said, really what I'm going to focus on and coming up with this recommended level, this really was the impetus, because we needed to start somewhere, essentially. So it is a journey, and obviously there are two pillars to the logo if we're going to develop a recommended level of pulses. The first is the presence of the ingredient obviously would have to be in the food, and that's going to be in the form of whole pulses or pulse ingredients. But the second is, and where we were sort of scoping, was should there be some nutritional component to this? And to do that, we really looked at three areas. We looked at dietary guidance and current intakes around the world. We looked at the nutrients from pulses, and would the incorporation of pulses make a substantial contribution to that food? And we looked at nutrient content claims with respect to regulatory guidelines around the world, and would it foster perhaps the ability to make a nutrient content claim? And we asked the question, should the rule be, or should a rule be, that pulses are included at such a level that you can make a nutrient content claim that is linked to the presence of pulses? So again, moving through this journey, we weren't really settling on anything. We're just sort of scoping and seeing what we could come up with. And we didn't necessarily land where you would think we would land. And you'll probably find it a little bit more interesting as I move through. So first thing we wanted to do, we wanted to see where dietary guidance landed us in terms of recommended intakes of pulses so far. So we took a look at dietary guidance all around the world, including Australia, India, Brazil, Nordic countries, countries in the EU, North America, and South Africa. And I'm going to quickly go through dietary guidance within each of these regions. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Dietary guidance. Australia Guide to Eating, a little bit more progressive than other countries, especially Canada, in that pulses are recommended within the lean meats, poultry, fish, eggs, tofu, nuts, and seeds group, or the protein group, and also in the vegetable group. One serving, if you're consuming pulses as a vegetable, is about 75 grams, and then one serving, if you're consuming pulses as a protein, is about 150 grams. The minimum 2 servings per week was found within the guidance around the meat section. I did just extrapolate it up to the vegetable section, but there is a recommendation within the vegetable section that greater than 5 servings of vegetables are consumed per day. When we look at the Nordic countries, there is Norden, which is a consortium that comes up with nutrient guidelines across the Nordic region. Pulses are identified as a food component to increase within the diet, and they are touted as being a vegetable and fruit as well as a meat alternative. You can see here that I do have 100 gram servings of pulses as a recommendation for vegetables and fruit, but that is not something that is explicitly indicated within the guideline. We did come up with that value based on recommendations for dietary fiber at 25 to 35 grams per day, alongside the recommendation of 125 to 175 grams per day of vegetables containing greater than 2 grams of fiber. If we look at Bulgaria, a traditional food pyramid, where pulses are identified as a meat alternative at 200 to 300 grams per serving, with the recommendation that they're consumed at least twice per week. And similar within Ireland, where pulses are considered as part of the protein group, with one serving being equivalent to about a half a cup. What's interesting about Ireland is when you read the scientific recommendations for the rationale for coming out with their updated dietary guidelines, they do recommend that pulses are consumed as part of the protein and vegetable group. But when you look at the final iteration of the dietary guidance, pulses were only identified as a protein. If we look at the UK, again, pulses are identified in the meat, fish, eggs, and beans group. But when you dig a little bit deeper in the National Health Service's website, they are also identified as a vegetable and fruit. 80 grams per day is the recommendation, which is what they identify as 3 heaping tablespoons. I would argue, based on our data later on, 80 grams is more closely related to about a half a cup of cooked pulses, but it likely depends on which type of pulses you're talking about. Spain is interesting in that they do have their own food pyramid, but they do recognize food pyramids from other reputable organizations within Spain, such as the Foundation of the Mediterranean Diet, where pulses are identified with a weekly recommendation at about 2 servings per week of legumes, and 1 serving is equivalent to about 60 to 80 grams. Greece, very similar, a weekly recommendation at 2 to 4 servings per week, with 1 serving being about 100 grams. And then when we look at India, pulses are identified as part of the cereal, millet, and pulses group, with a recommendation again being about 80 grams per day. South Africa recently updated their food guidelines, where pulses and soy were given their own group within the guidelines. And they used the South African Journal of Clinical Nutrition as a platform for promoting the rationale around their new dietary guidance. Unfortunately, within that chapter, they don't indicate a recommended amount. So I did reach out to the author, Dr. Venter, who is the author of this chapter within the journal, and she indicated that the current recommendation is about 3 cups per week or half a cup per day. Brazil is very interesting in that in the past they did have a pyramid similar to other countries, where pulses were recommended as a legume at 3 servings per day, equivalent to 45 calories. But as some of you may know, that Brazil has been very progressive. They have updated their dietary guidance and sort of moved away from the pyramid scheme and sort of moved into sound dietary advice and looking at dietary patterns. So, eating minimally processed foods, eliminating sugar, salt, and fat, which is very progressive, and it's something that has garnered a lot of attention in Canada as a model that perhaps Canada will move forward to. Dietary guidelines in the US have recently been updated in late 2015. Focuses on dietary patterns. Pulses are identified as a vegetable and protein. There's the US dietary pattern, the Mediterranean dietary pattern, and the vegetarian dietary pattern, to which the US focuses on. The US dietary pattern and the Mediterranean pattern are actually very similar when you look at the recommendations. The only difference is that the US pattern contains more dairy. Overall, though, there's a weekly recommendation of about a quarter cup to 3 cups per week of pulses. And then finally, because I'm Canadian, I have to talk about Canada. The coloring book that is the Canada's Food Guide. It's a little bit of an embarrassment. I'm not going to don't report this. Canada, of course, tries to do everything. So they try to come up with scientific recommendations and something that is consumer friendly all in one, and this is what you get. You get a coloring book. Pulses are here identified as a meat alternative at 175 mils or 3/4 cup. Obviously has to be different from everybody else. And you can see here that they do give somewhat of a weekly recommendation, and it's sort of each week plan a couple of meals, dried, canned beans, and lentils. So it's not really a stern recommendation, it's sort of a roundabout way of saying eat more pulses. So it's very interesting, and it was an interesting way to start the process of coming up with the recommendation, but it obviously was a lot of information. There was a lot of different recommendations, weekly and daily recommendations, so on and so forth. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to see, okay, so what is a household measure of pulses? I think that's what we need, because this is something that's going to be consumer friendly. We have to be able to communicate with consumers. So we took our nutritional data across various varieties of lentils, chickpeas, beans, and peas, and we measured what was 1 metric cup and what was a half a cup. And what we found was the mean for each was 210 grams, 105 grams, and the median was 183 to 91. So from that, we made a little bit of an extrapolation. We said, okay, a half a cup of pulses is 100 grams, and 1 cup of pulses is 200 grams across all different varieties, because there's obviously going to be some variation. And then we applied that to what we found within the dietary guidelines around the world. And what we saw was, when we considered the standard deviation of plus or minus 20 with the half a cup, what we found was, for the majority of countries and nations and associations that make the recommendations around diet and pulses, most of them did fit into that half cup range, 80 to 100 grams. Of course, Canada has to stand on its own. Bulgaria is up there on its own. Australia is there because of that meat recommendation, where the recommendation is 1 cup as opposed to the half a cup. But what's sort of a sigh of relief is that even if you focus in on these larger recommendations that are above this half a cup, you're encompassing this half a cup. So if there are benefits nutritionally to the half a cup, countries that are recommending more, you're going to achieve that threshold. So moving forward with coming up with the recommendation, we did use the 100 grams as our baseline threshold. So with our further investigations into nutrients and nutrient content claims, we did use the half a cup or 100 grams per day or week or whichever as a baseline. So next, what we want to do is look at current intakes of pulses across regions. So using the literature and dietary surveys within different regions, we evaluated what was the typical consumption of pulses or even legumes. And not surprisingly, and I'm going to focus in right here on Australia, Canada, and the US, consumption of pulses isn't very high. In Australia, 75 to 92.1% of individuals consume no pulses. In Canada, it's about 87%. And the US, it's just under 90%. But you can see it for the people who are consuming pulses, they are reaching that threshold of 100 grams per day. In Australia, for example, it's 98 to 112 grams per day. In Canada, it's 86 to 113 grams per day. And the US, 3/4 of individuals who do consume pulses do consume greater than half a cup per day. You saw some significant legume consumption in Japan, but we can't differentiate between soy and pulses, and that was commented on earlier today. And we did see in Greece that in individuals who are greater than 70 years of age, you did get 63 grams of pulses consumed. So from this, what it does tell us is that the 100 grams per day is achievable. Not per day, sorry, the 100 grams recommendation is achievable, so it might be a valid threshold to strive for. Next, what we want to look at is nutrients from pulses. Does the 100 grams facilitate a meaningful amount of, would it facilitate a meaningful amount of nutrients to be consumed by an individual? We know that pulses contain substantial amounts of protein, fiber, vitamins, and minerals. And when we look at pulses and we compare pulses to grains, for example, per 100 grams, across all of these nutrients, protein, fiber, folic acid, iron, potassium, magnesium, and phosphorus, pulses do contain more of these nutrients. So we want to apply this to perhaps a label. So we use beans, just as an example here today, 100 grams of beans. And this is a Canadian nutrient facts table. This is found on every food label in Canada of manufactured food. And you can see here in the label, you have your nutrients on the left, you have the amount as well, and then you have the percent daily value, which is essentially the percent of the recommended daily intake of that nutrient within that food. And you can see, and what Health Canada has done, they've come out with a marketing campaign to help consumers identify nutrients within a food that contain a lot of a nutrient or an insignificant amount of a nutrient. And what they've decided on is that a nutrient that is present in a food at less than 5% the daily value, that's a little, and if it has more than 15%, that's a lot. So what we're striving for in this exercise is anything above 5%. So when we apply this campaign to this scenario at 100 grams of beans, for example, all of these nutrients are above the 5% threshold, which would indicate that it doesn't contain a little. It might not always contain a significant amount, but it contains more than a little. The reason why there's nothing there for protein is in Canada we don't have a reference value for protein. We were at, in Pulse Canada, we're a part of the Pulse Task Force, and I believe Australia Pulse is a part of that as well. And we were at a meeting in I believe it was late November of last year, and one person sitting around the table said, when we were discussing this a little bit, they said, well, what about Health Canada's, that gauge that I discussed, what if we apply that gauge broadly? Maybe that's our way of deciding whether or not our recommendation works. So from that discussion that we had, we did take that Health Canada exercise and we applied it to food labels across jurisdictions. So in Australia, obviously you have something similar to our nutrition facts table. And if we apply this exercise to 100, based on the reference values in Australia, you get a similar scenario where it would meet the checkoff at above 5%. Similar to the US, you would meet the checkoff. If you applied it to dietary recommendations from the Institute of Medicine, the same story occurs. And then in the EU, it's interesting, in the EU, they do identify 15% as a threshold for a significant amount of a nutrient. And again, in this situation, it works out. So what we're trying to say here is that, okay, well, maybe 100 grams works because it is contributing a significant amount of nutrition to the food based on the nutrients within pulses that are available in substantial amounts. But the other way we want to think of it, well, maybe claims would be the way to go. Maybe nutrient content claims, and maybe would be a way to identify a significant amount of pulses in food, and maybe we put the label on foods where pulses make a high enough contribution of nutrients within that food that you can claim something. So if pulses contain enough fiber to make a fiber content claim within the food, maybe that's the threshold for using the Pulse brand. And obviously, when we look across regions around the world, there are different thresholds for making nutrient content claims. I'm not going to go through this, but I think the underlying story here is that across jurisdictions, for these nutrients, 100 grams does meet the threshold for nutrient content claim for all these foods. So that's essentially the exercise, and after going through all of that, the question was, so what? What does all this mean? What do you do with all this information? And it's easy for us to sit around a board table in Winnipeg, in Canada, and talk about what we came up with and where we should go, but obviously outside advice is always beneficial. So we do have a scientific advisory board for the Pulse brand, and it is represented by international academics across the world, including Australia. So we did have a fairly long conference call. We presented all of this information to individuals on the board and basically had them hash it out and discuss what we came up with and where we should go with the Pulse brand, perhaps the Pulse brand with a pledge, with respect to a recommendation. And they did see a half a cup or 100 gram of pulses as a likely amount to be recommended to people to try and consume and get nutritional benefits. And it's important to note that they didn't say per week or per day. They just said 100 grams. And that sort of coincides with what we see with nutrient guidance around the world. And they did say people shouldn't be expected to eat 100 grams of pulses in a single serving. And I think that speaks to the presentation this morning. We want to get more pulses incorporated into processed foods to improve the nutritional profile. 100 grams of pulses is a lot, and I would challenge anyone to get that into a slice of bread, for example, or a serving of breakfast cereal. So what should the minimum inclusion level be? So we have this recommendation at 100 grams. Should there be a threshold? Should it be based on perhaps nutrients? Perhaps 10%, maybe 10 grams should be a minimum, or maybe a quarter cup. There has to be, even though we've set a recommendation perhaps at 100 grams, it doesn't necessarily mean that should be within a single food. And in fact, when we did a market survey of different foods across categories like soup, dips, beverages, and ready-to-eat meals, we did note that across all of these types of foods, the amount of pulses within a serving was less than 100 grams. So obviously the 100 grams wasn't going to work. We had to come up with some sort of percentage of that amount. And then the other challenge there is that it doesn't only stop, it's easy to make these recommendations with respect to whole pulses, but we have whole other sectors popping up with respect to pulse ingredients, and that is isolating the fibers and getting more pulse fibers into foods and isolating proteins to boost the protein content of foods. And how would we extrapolate our recommendation for whole pulses to that of pulse ingredients? So one way is just using straight equivalents. So here on the left we have 15 grams of whole pulses and 25 grams of whole pulses, with the assumption that 100 grams of whole cooked pulses is equivalent to 52 grams of whole cooked pulses. The threshold for the recommendation would just correspond to that extrapolation. So 15 grams of whole cooked pulses is equivalent to 7.8 grams of whole pulse flour. And note that the amount of protein, this is obviously an error because I was sleepy. This is on the left is fiber, and on the left is fiber, and the right is on the left is protein, and on the right is fiber. The amount of each of these are equivalent. But then, whenever we talk about nutrition and a logo or anything on pack that has to do nutrition, we have to be cognizant of the regulations across the world. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that linking the Pulse brand to a recommended consumption of pulses, no matter where we land on a per serving amount or within a food, could elicit regulatory enforcement. We acknowledge the fact that the recommended 100 grams is not equal to a minimum amount within a serving that should be recommended. And where that should be a quarter or 25%, we don't know. But as soon as we start moving away from that 100 grams and you start getting closer to thresholds where nutrient content claims start to come into play, and there could be nutritional labeling and claim implications. Not every region around the world has profiling, nutrition profiling as part of their recommendations. In Canada, we don't. And the government of Canada has indicated that there's no initiative on their radar to change that. Once you start moving away from that 100 grams, which is very high and very nutrient dense, you start to get inconsistent messaging across regions. The messaging becomes complicated, and then you might fall into the scenario where you put the logo on your food, but you might have to put a quantitative declaration. And we all know that labeling space on foods is limited, and for the most part, in my experience, manufacturers really don't want to go there. And we have to remember also that it's easy for anybody to come up with a logo or come up with a recommendation or come up with a profile, but who's assuming the risk? The food industry is ultimately assuming the risk, so you want them to use your logo, but if there's risk of regulatory enforcement, you don't know where you stand, with regulations in each region, chances of buy-in with the food industry is going to be rather limited. So where are we now? So we're very comfortable with the 100-gram recommendation, and whether that's in a serving or a week, it's really arbitrary. For the purposes of the Pulse Pledge, the half cup seems to work, so 100 grams seems to work well. So that's what the Pulse Pledge has moved forward with. So if you go on the Pulse Pledge website, this is what you'll see. You can sign up with your email address, and you're essentially pledging to consume about a half a cup or 100 grams of pulses in a week. But the risks stood too high with respect to linking nutrition to the Pulse brand, and that was primarily because of regulatory constraints around the world. So the Pulse brand is going to be implemented internationally around the world, but it's moving away from nutrition being a fundamental component of its use. What the Pulse brand is going to be, it's going to be basically an identifier to indicate the presence of pulses within a food, with a threshold being 5% pulses by weight within your food. And then when you combine all of the pulse ingredients within your food, it has to be within the first 5 ingredients within your ingredient deck. And this is an example of a label that will be using the Pulse brand, has committed to be using the Pulse brand thus far in the UK for butter beans, canned butter beans. And you can see here its utilization indicating the presence of pulses. Pulse Canada spearheaded this initiative, but the keys will one day be handed over to the Global Pulse Confederation because it is an international initiative. The Pulse brand, it's hoped that it will be used around the world in multiple regions. But this work was not in vain. We are publishing a manuscript as a commentary to outline the process with respect to the recommendation. Whether or not you get the recommendation from ingredients or whole pulses, we do think the recommendation is fair, so to speak. We do think that it's reasonable, so we do want to put this information out there. We're in the middle of drafting the manuscript. It looks like this so far. It's probably going to look like this by the end of it, at the end of the process. So with that, if there are any questions, I apologize about, I was a little bit, had a lot of jargon there. I'm running about half speed. I succumbed to jet lag, so.
You've done very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.